And now we're recording.
Yeah, thanks Penny for the introduction. Talk about how we can use volcanic rocks as a tool to look into the upper mantle, and specifically look at sort of processes behind dynamic topography. So this work, as Penny mentioned, I've started during my PhD, which is why there is quite a large, long list of collaborators from a number of different institutions. And the talk's going to be talking a lot about dynamic topography, so I thought I should just start with a definition of what I mean by that. So when I say dynamic topography, I mean any sort of topography that's caused within the convecting mantle, as opposed to sort of tectonic topography, which you might expect from crustal thickening or extension. So an example here on the left-hand side, if you've got a cold downwelling, that might draw the surface down and give you a basin. Or if you've got a hot plume upwelling, that would push the surface up. And importantly, also, you're bringing hot material from depth closer to the surface. So in that case, you might then expect to see melts form in the upper mantle, which might make it out to the surface as volcanoes. So the question really is, can we use the composition of these volcanic rocks at the surface to try and sort of back calculate, well, is there a plume there to start with? What temperature is it, and what depth do these melts come from? So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And I've split the talk into two parts. So the first half is going to be a nice, neat little story about the Western North America, which I'm going to use as a sort of as a proof of concept. So I'll show you why we think dynamic topography is happening there. I'll show you that, yes, we can use volcanic compositions as a tool to understand the upper mantle. And importantly, those volcanic inferences also match what we see in independent observations from geophysics or geology, say. And then the second half of the talk is going to be something slightly more complicated in looking at two topographic domes in Northeast Brazil and Southwest Africa, and sort of really looking at what are the exact mechanisms of dynamic uplift in these regions. But let's start with part one. So this section is mostly was done during my PhD, and we published it a couple of years ago in G Cubed. The beautiful picture in the background are the Hopi Buttes in central Colorado Plateau. But sort of let's start right from the beginning. If the first thing you notice, if you look at a topographic map of North America, is you notice the difference in elevation between west and east. So in the west, and especially sort of the Colorado Plateau region, you've got high elevations of up to 2 kilometers, whereas in the east, in the Great Plains, you're basically at sea level, a couple hundred meters elevation. And we know that this high elevation in the west is actually very young. So back in the Cretaceous, this whole area was underwater. So this red dot here shows where the Colorado Plateau is today. So present day, that sits at 2 kilometers elevation. 70 million years ago or so, it was underwater. And the reason we know that it was underwater is actually because there are expansive marine shales. So this is these purple slopes are the Mancos Shale on the Colorado Plateau, but very similar sediments can be found all the way up in Canada. And these sediments contain abundant sort of evidence of marine life. So there's an early shark and some crinoids. So definitely marine back in the Cretaceous, 2 kilometers elevation today. So we know the uplift is very young. We also know that the crustal thicknesses don't really change across this region. So these circles, colored circles, are colored by Moho depth. And you'll see that on the Colorado Plateau, you get very similar colors, similar values around 45 kilometers. as in the Great Plains. The yellow circles here are the basin range, which have seen a fair bit of extension. So actually, these are thinner crustal thicknesses associated with high elevations, which means that what we're looking at here is not your classic tectonic topography. So this topography is not supported by a thick crustal root. Instead, we think it's highly likely dynamic in origin. And one reason why we think that is because we see these big positive gravity anomalies. And they're essentially a proxy for mantle convection. So these red contours here, these positive anomalies might indicate that there's an upwelling sitting on the plate in this location. And interestingly, if you overlay the location of volcanic rocks across North America, they pretty much exclusively only lie in these regions of positive gravity anomalies. So on the very western margin here, you've got the subduction-related magmas, but then further inland, there is a bunch of activity that shouldn't really be there, and that may well be related to a mantle upwelling. So the obvious place to look if you're looking at the mantle is at seismic tomography. So this is a slice through a shear wave velocity model from Schaefer and Lebedev 2014 at 100 kilometers depth. And in the blue colors, you're seeing the very fast velocities of cratonic North America, so very thick lithospheric root. Whereas the red colors in the west are anomalously slow velocities, which might indicate that there is a thermal anomaly under there. So hotter or slightly hotter than average, than normal temperatures. And again, if we overlay volcanic locations, these match really well with where we see the slow shear wave velocities. There does seem to be a link there. And I should say I've colored these volcanic samples by age. So all of the red circles here have erupted within the last 30 million years or so. So the idea now is to see, can we use the composition of all of these red circles to actually pinpoint, quantify what is the temperature of the mantle under these regions. So here's just a zoom in of the Western US. The colored samples are the same volcanic samples I've showed you before, which come from a big online catalog, NAFDAT database. The gray circles are samples, new analyses that I've added to this database. And they largely come from a collection by one of my colleagues, Godfrey Fitton, but I also went on to field campaigns and collected some new samples. Just to give you an idea of what these rocks look like, or their origin. So you've got your classic intraplate cinder cones and some pretty extensive lava flows as well. So we've got a fairly large geochemical database, but we're only really interested in those melts that have been generated in the asthenosphere and have come straight up to the surface without any contamination through lithospheric metasomatic agents, say, or that have fractionated and in crustal magma chambers to an extent where they've changed composition dramatically. So we undertook 2 screening steps. The first one, to really limit the amount of fractionation samples have undergone. So what you're looking at here is iron against magnesium oxide. And the most primitive melts generally tend to start on the right-hand side of this plot here. And then as they fractionate, they evolve towards the left. So I've introduced a cutoff of 7 to 8% magnesium oxide, and only select those samples that have higher MgO than that. So they're the most primitive samples in the database. So the colored symbols on here are the ones I accept. Gray and black are ones I reject. The second screening step is to do with lithospheric or subduction-related contamination. So I'm plotting lanthanum barium against lanthanum niobium. Barium is a highly fluid mobile element, so that's very enriched in subduction-related fluids and melts. Niobium is not. So any subduction melt you'd expect to see in the bottom right corner of this plot. Whereas this dashed ellipse is showing the global distribution of ocean island basalts. And there, we think they come pretty much straight up from the asthenospheric mantle. So they're a good sample of what asthenospheric melts. So I've simply only selected samples that fall within this OIB field. So I've now got a screen data set, and the different colors you're seeing are actually different geographic provinces. The two that are important for this talk today are the Snake River Plain in red, with Yellowstone at its tip, and then the Colorado Plateau in dark blue. So that's where that picture at the beginning was from. The Hopi Buttes are in here. So we've got a screen database now. How can we go from that geochemical composition to mantle potential temperature and lithospheric thickness? The way we did that was using an inverse model first developed by Mackenzie and Lyons in 1991. And it's taking the average sample composition, so the rare earth composition is on the top left panel here, rare earths and the a normalized composition on the y-axis. And we're trying to fit these compositions by varying the melt fraction as a function of depth. So that's what you're seeing in the bottom right panel here, melt fraction against depth. And these diagonal contours are potential temperature melting paths. So if you imagine a package of mantle upwelling that's got a potential temperature of 1300 degrees, it will start melting at 60 kilometers depth and then evolve along this path. If your mantle is hotter, you'll start melting deeper, and at any given depth, you will have more melt. So if we fit these sample compositions for the Snake River Plain, this line is the model fit, and you can see we're fitting the rare earth elements very well. I'm predicting this sort of melting curve, which starts melting around 80 kilometers depth, stops around around 50, and the sort of the path it takes is equivalent to a potential temperature of 50 and 13 degrees. I should say that we're assuming that all of the melts are entirely generated within the asthenosphere, which means that the top of the melting column, so here, is the base of the lithosphere. And the other two panels on the slide are other elements that you've also measured in the rocks, and that we can predict in a forward model once we've identified the best fitting. They're essentially a quality control how well our model is doing recreating these chemical compositions. And in this case, we're doing pretty well. That's the example for the Snake River Plain. So the second example from the Colorado Plateau. And you can just notice flicking between these two slides that the rare earth element compositions are quite different, which is reflected in a very different melt distribution. We've got much smaller melt fractions at slightly deeper depths as well. So now the sort of the top of the melting column lithospheric thickness is around 60 kilometers. The temperature is only about 1320, 1330, which is about ambient mantle. And again, we can fit the other elements pretty well. The plane has temperatures of about 1365 or up to 1370, 1380. Colorado Plateau is about ambient. So there's a sort of up to a 50-degree thermal anomaly sitting under here, but it's not the same everywhere. And actually all of these other volcanic provinces lie somewhere between. So far, so good. one of the great advantages of working in the US is that the existence of the US array, or the Earthscope experiment, where they covered the entire country in a really dense array of seismometers, and as a consequence produced high quality tomographic models. Microphone. Sorry. Okay, so here are 4 examples of tomographic models that all have come out of the US array, or use US array data. The top 2 are global models, so they are quite coarse resolution, whereas the bottom row are regional examples that only look at the Western US, or the sort of contiguous US. And therefore can afford higher resolution. But you can see that in all 4 of these different models, they're basically resolving the same sort of features. We've got slow velocities in red on the western side, and then fast velocities in the cratonic regions on the right. And in all cases, where the location of these slow velocities is overlaps with where we see volcanism at the surface. So I'm just going to talk about the bottom right model.
Marthe, you are muted.
Sorry. How long have you not been able to hear me?
You can repeat just beginning of this slide again.
This slide or the previous one?
Yeah, this one, the current one.
This one. Okay, so that's just one example of a tomographic model that's come out of the US array, and just to show the correlation between the slow shear wave velocities in red with my screened geochemical database, which are the symbols. And you can actually already see, looking at this in the Snake River Plain, you've got the reddest colors, so the slowest velocities. There we go, which coincide with the high potential temperatures that we've calculated from the geochemical modeling for the Snake River Plain. Whereas in the Colorado Plateau, where we've got ambient mantle potential temperature, the shear wave velocities are about normal, so not anomalous in either way, so they look white here. And we can plot that up properly. So you're looking at the shear wave velocity at a 75-kilometer depth slice against lanthanum and terbium. Lanthanum and terbium is a ratio of 2 rare earth elements, so essentially the slope of those diagrams I showed you earlier. And we can roughly equate that to melt fraction in this case, and melt fraction to temperature. So in the case of the Snake River Plain, and in the red samples here, the red dots, circles, we calculated the highest temperatures for them, and they also have the slowest velocities. Whereas the Colorado Plateau samples in dark blue had low temperatures and some of the fastest velocities. And there's generally a pretty good correlation here. But we can go one step further and extract velocity profiles from this tomographic model, one for each volcanic province. The dashed line here is the reference model. So you can see that most of these volcanic velocity profiles are slower than the velocity model, the reference model, sorry, between sort of 50 and 120 kilometers depth. And we can convert these velocity profiles into temperature profiles, following an approach of Priestley-Mackenzie in 2013. And you can see how the slow velocities of the Snake River Plain profile map into the highest temperature profile, and the fastest velocities map into the coldest temperatures in the Colorado Plateau. And the actual temperatures you're seeing here, so these dashed lines are mantle adiabats for different potential temperature. So the temperatures predicted from this calculation lie somewhere between 1330 and 1380, which is pretty consistent with the numbers we were getting out of the geochemical modeling. And this dark solid line is the dry solidus. So actually, in all cases, these thermal temperature profiles cross the dry solidus. So we are expecting melting. And in the snake river plain, we overstep the solidus the most and would expect the largest melt fractions, which is also consistent with the volcanic geochemistry. So just a direct comparison between the temperatures calculated from the shear wave velocities on the y-axis against potential temperatures calculated from the geochemical modeling. The dotted line is a one-to-one line just to guide the eye. And I've noted that this is quite zoomed in. So within 20 degrees or so, these two completely independent methods actually agree with each other, which is pretty amazing, I would say, because I mean, when do geophysics and geochemistry ever agree that well? So I think we can be pretty confident that we're in the right sort of temperature ballpark for this region, and there's definitely a difference between melts on the Colorado Plateau compared to the Snake River Plain. And just to take you back to the dynamic topography story I started with, I'm going to show you a sort of slightly funky cross-section that goes through all of the volcanic fields and then into the cratonic area. So we're starting on the left-hand side in the Rio Grande Rift, through the basin and range, Colorado Plateau, into Snake River Plain, and then the cratonic area. So you've got topography along the top, and the sort of the high topography correlates with the slow velocity anomalies in the tomography, whereas the cratonic region has lower elevations and fast velocities. And we can now do some very simple calculations just using the potential temperatures and the lithospheric thicknesses we've calculated. Work out what would we expect elevations to be. Does that match what we see in the topography? And we can also work out what the heat flow would be. And I didn't say this before, but we actually also see elevated heat flow in the bottom panel here. High heat flow matches with this area of high topography, and where we see the slow velocity anomalies in the mantle. So you can calculate this in two ways. One, using the geophysical data, so the tomography model, and a geophysically inferred LAB, lithospheric thickness, which is this dashed line here. Or you can use the volcanic measurements in the colored circles. But both of these methods actually give you a sort of the calculated elevations match the actual observed elevations surprisingly well. And in the heat flow, we're also in the right sort of ballpark area. So we can't match all of the intricacies in the elevation and heat flow data, but that's probably simply because there are sort of small scale variations within the crust that we couldn't take into account in these sort of simple calculations. But overall, the sort of the small thermal anomaly beneath a relatively thin plate seems to match both the elevations and the heat flow we observe. So just to summarize this part, we've got elevations of about 2 kilometers in the west of the continent that seem to be dynamically supported. And you can use the trace element composition of volcanic rocks in the region to work out mantle potential temperatures, which seem to be elevated by up to 50 degrees. And they also record very thin lithosphere of no more than 60 kilometers. And these results are consistent, very consistent with independent estimates from seismology, from tomography. And importantly, if you use those numbers, you can actually match the observed elevation and the observed heat flow. So hopefully I've convinced you that volcanic rocks can be useful to do this sort of thing and to look into the upper mantle. So I'm now going to take you to a bit further south to Brazil and Southwest Africa. So this is some work that's actually just been accepted in EPSL, so that should be available within the next few weeks or so. And the picture here is a volcanic neck in the Borborema Plateau in northeast Brazil. So we're looking at two volcanic domes, one in northeast Brazil, one in Angola in Southwest Africa. If we zoom in, you can see that there's the sort of the high elevations of the Borborema Plateau on the left and the Angolan dome on the right. And both of these sit about a kilometer of the sort of surrounding landscape. Curiously, these are all of the earthquakes ever recorded in the global earthquake catalogs. So there really isn't a lot going on, and any earthquakes that are sort of large enough that you can calculate a fault plane solution actually records strike slip events rather than something compressional. So that's telling us that this topography can't be supported tectonically. So probably something dynamic going on. And if you look at long wave gravity anomalies, there you go, big positive anomalies right under these topographic domes. And in both cases, we actually also get some volcanic activity that coincides both with the positive gravity anomalies and the high elevations. So in Brazil, you've got a range of mostly alkali basalts that erupted over the last 30 or so million years. And you've also got a volcanic island offshore, Fernando de Noronha. In Angola, there's actually only one known young volcanic event of Pleistocene age, which is mostly allochites or carbonatites, so very low fraction melts. And if you weren't convinced that something dynamic is going on here, I'm going to show you two transects along these dashed lines through residual depth measurements of Hoggart et al. 2017. So these sort of map out the location of the domes very nicely along both margins with these reddish positive residual depths, which is essentially where the seafloor sits at a higher elevation than you'd expect based on the plate cooling model. So pretty sure there's something dynamic going on here. I'm just going to look at the age of the topography as well. So I'm showing Borborema or Brazil on the top and Angola on the bottom half. And we've got a number of different geological constraints that can tell us about the aging, the timing of uplift. So in the yellow diamonds here are uplifted coastal deposits, so sort of elevated marine terraces. These blue polygons are marine rocks that now sit at some elevation. The circles are the volcanic rocks again, and these green squares are apatite fission track analyses. So they measuring denudation of the basement rocks. And if we can put that sort of on a time axis, so starting back in the Cretaceous here on the left and then through to present day on the right. So this blue square here corresponds to this marine deposit that's Cretaceous in age, but currently sits at 800 meters elevation. These blue bars across the background are the exhumation events from the apatite fission track data. And the histograms across the top are the volcanic events. So in Brazil, it's a bit more long-lived. In Angola, there's just the one event that we know of. but both of them are quite young and seem to coincide with some form of exhumation event in the after data. And we can now use the river profiles, so the shape of rivers, to invert for an uplift history, uplift rate. And so these are the solid lines, black lines with the gray error bounds. And you see that in both cases, nothing much happens until around 30 million years or so, when the uplift rates increase. But then most of the uplift seems to occur within the last 10 million years or so. And that coincides with the volcanic activity. Okay, so I've said this is probably dynamic uplift, but that still leaves us with three options of what the actual mechanism behind this dynamic support could be. So you could have your classic mantle plume that pushes the surface up, or you could just have a thermal anomaly beneath the plate, so without the sort of active push component, but just the extra thermal buoyancy will give you uplift. And that could be either lateral flow or a sort of a small scale convection cell. Or you could simply have lithospheric thinning and replacing cold, dense lithosphere with hotter, less dense asthenosphere, which lifts everything up. So in order to decide between these three different mechanisms, we want to look at mantle potential temperature and lithospheric thickness. So let's start with the volcanic geochemistry. This should look familiar. Across the top here are compositions of the onshore Brazilian province, so the Borborema province. The middle is the Brazilian volcanic island of Fernando de Noronha, and across the bottom is Angola. So the left-hand panel here are the rare earth element compositions, average compositions observed in the samples. And the right-hand panel is what we're interested in, so the melt fraction distribution as a function of depth. So if we fit these data, in both of the Brazilian cases, we're predicting very similar melt paths that come up to sort of lithospheric thickness or top of melting column of around 60 kilometers and correspond to mantle potential temperatures of around 1330 degrees. So again, that's pretty much ambient mantle. Angola is slightly trickier, as you can see by the various lines on these diagrams. I've already said that they're carbonatic, so that means that they're probably not generated purely in the asthenospheric mantle, but rather have a lithospheric metasomatic component in them as well. So my best fitting attempt at modeling these, I start with a very small amount of asthenospheric melting, that then, as it percolates into the base of the lithosphere, locally heats the base of the lithosphere and remobilizes metasomatic veins, which is the dark blue line on this melt fraction diagram here. And then you sort of average those two compositions to give you the model best fit. And it's not amazing. There are many, many uncertainties, especially with this particular model. But the important thing out of here is that in these three cases, we need anomalously hot mantle potential temperatures. All of these could be explained just with sort of ambient mantle. So what about shear wave velocities? So on the map here in red colors are slow, anomalously slow velocities that again seem to match with where we see the volcanic distributions. And we can extract velocity profiles and convert them to temperature. And again, the dotted lines here are mantle adiabats for different potential temperatures. So our three velocity models converted to temperature lie somewhere between 1300 and 1350 or so, maybe up to 1380 degrees potential temperature. So that is consistent with the geochemical story of we don't necessarily see a big thermal anomaly. Interestingly also, none of these temperature profiles cross the dry solidus. So in order to make these profiles generate some melt, we need to invoke some water or CO2 in the mantle source. You can also calculate lithospheric thickness from the shear wave velocity model. And again, you're seeing lots of red where these volcanic rocks are and where the high topography is. And that corresponds to lithospheric thickness of around 100 kilometers or less. So that's really quite thin, and thinner than we would expect for these areas. And again, it's roughly consistent with the geochemical volcanic story. And just finally, in Angola, we actually also have a number of Cretaceous kimberlites that have brought up xenoliths from the base of the lithosphere. So we can use those to work out the lithospheric thickness back in Cretaceous time. So I'm showing you 3 pictures here. On the left-hand side is central Angola, which is essentially the Angolan dome. And then middle and right, you're moving towards the northeast, so on towards the Congo craton. So these circles here are the pressures and temperatures estimated from the xenoliths, xenocrysts technically. And you can use these to fit geotherms to these regions. And this kink in the thermal profile tells you roughly where the lithosphere ends, where the asthenosphere starts. So in the Congo on the right here, we've got very thick lithosphere, somewhere around 250 kilometers, whereas it seems to get thinner towards the Angolan dome. So even back in the Cretaceous, we had lithospheric thickness of only about 150 kilometers, which is thinner than what we see in the neighboring cratonic areas. And if we directly compare that to the present day thermal profiles extracted from the tomography model, you see in the cratonic regions, so the middle and the right-hand panel, the red and the black curves more or less overlap. So they are pretty consistent and sort of record the same lithospheric thicknesses back in the Cretaceous as now. Whereas in central Angola, under the Angolan dome, at the present day, you get hotter temperatures coming up closer to the surface, which indicates sort of a lithospheric thinning of around about 30 kilometers or so. So just to finish off, I want to show you 2 profiles that go through the domes. So here is the topography and the high topography of the dome in Brazil on the left, Angola on the right. These white circles are the volcanic locations. The lines across the top are the gravity anomalies, which coincide exactly with these topographic domes. Lithospheric thickness, and I've converted the shear wave tomography model to potential temperatures, which are the colors here. And I've also plotted on the melting regions predicted from the volcanic modeling. So you can see in all 3 cases, they're colored by potential temperatures. So these are all not particularly warm colors. So more or less ambient mantle potential temperature, and all of the melting happens right at the base of the lithosphere. And even the colors sort of a bit deeper in the mantle, they might look very red, but that's actually only around 1350 degrees potential temperature. So we don't see any evidence for a deep-seated mantle plume. There's nothing in any of the tomography models, and the volcanics certainly don't require anomalously hot temperatures to be generated. We do see potentially a little bit of a thermal anomaly, but no more than 30 or 50 degrees. And really the main mechanism for this uplift seems to be lithospheric thinning. And in the case of Angola, we've got direct evidence of lithospheric thinning occurring between the Cretaceous and the present day. But also interestingly, there was sort of basal lithospheric topography even back in Cretaceous time, which might have focused mantle flow, and then that could have facilitated further sort of erosion and thinning of the base of the lithosphere, perhaps. So I think I've said all of that. I just want to finish with a short outlook into what I'm working on at the moment, because all of the examples I've talked about today are all basically present day, where we have geophysical data that we can compare the volcanic data to. But what if we could potentially take this back through time? So I'm currently working on a project in Australia. So through our collaboration with Geoscience Australia, I got access to a database of all mafic volcanic rocks across Australia from all time, which are all of these colorful circles here. So in the red and orange are your Eastern Australian volcanics, which are sort of the last 30 or so million years. But then you go all the way back to like Archean rocks in the Yilgarn. And the challenge now is to see, well, can we actually use these various volcanic rocks and their compositions to sort of track the evolution of the lithosphere in these various cratonic regions through time. More to come on that. Thanks very much, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much. Marthe, it's often funny because people can't make a lot of noise here, but I do see quite a lot of claps going on. So thank you for a very interesting talk. There's actually some questions in the chat.
Okay.
Jan Kuhn, would you like to say your question, or would you like me to read it out? I think you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay. Yes, thank you. So my question is, as I typed in, is there any larger scale tomographic data to show where the thermal anomaly beneath the Snake River come from? So because compared to the ambient mantle temperature, you mentioned the Snake River just to show a small thermal excess. So I'm curious, is it rooted like in the deeper mantle, or where it come from?
Yeah, that's very interesting actually. I think as far as I know, none of the tomographic models show anything in the deeper mantle, in the lower mantle underneath the Western US. But most of them see something sort of above the mantle transition zone. But people have argued also about the sort of the role of the old Farallon slab, which still might be somewhere under the plate there and might interfere with any upwelling, or might even cause an upwelling as well. So I think the differences in the volcanic provinces between Snake River Plain and Colorado Plateau, say, is probably modulated by the base of the lithosphere. So in the Snake River Plain, you've got sort of the thinnest lithosphere, which therefore might channel flow towards that area, which is why we're seeing the hottest temperatures there, would be my guess.
Thank you.
Thank you. We also have a question from Jean-Pierre. Go ahead, Jean-Pierre. I see you've unmuted.
Hello?
Yes, we can
Hello,
hear you.
Penny.
Yes, do you want me to read it?
Good day. Yeah, see that 5 a.m. So,
oh, okay, it's 5 a.m. I'll read it.
Okay. So, please, I would like to know if there is an implication with geothermal energy research in volcanic areas, because, for example, in my country here, we have thermal springs at reaching 74 degrees Celsius in an area in the northern part of the country where geophysicists results say that the mole is less than 30 kilometers, about 25 kilometers. So is it, can we expect to have implication with geothermal energy research potential in the northern part of my country, the Cameroon volcanic line that Marthe knows quite very well. Okay, thanks, Benny, and have a nice day.
Thank you. So I think most of the geothermal energy actually comes from the sort of the shallow volcanic systems. So yes, sort of broad scale, there is a correlation there, especially if you've got young volcanism, but the sort of the heat that you would harness using geothermal energy would come from the sort of the upper crustal magma reservoirs, I guess, rather than straight from the mantle, I think, in most cases. What it does have an implication on is the sort of longer term thermal maturation of, say, oil and gas reservoirs, potentially. So I know that BP, for example, have become more and more interested in this sort of work. Because regions where they thought, oh, this region looks like there might be lots of oil down here, when they drilled it, they actually realized, oh, it's all gas. And yes, okay, that makes sense because there are lots of volcanics in the area.
Okay. Thank you, Marthe. Thanks. Merci. Okay.
Thank you. And thank you for getting up at 5 a.m. or 4 a.m.
Okay, yeah. I'm very happy. Thanks for the talk. Yes.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
That's dedication.
Okay, thanks very much.
Hervoy, would you like me to read your question or would you like to unmute yourself? I think that means I read the question. So Marthe, seismological images aren't really the true Earth. And so Hervoy's asking whether you take the uncertainties in the tomographic models into account in your modeling, in particular error propagation for calculating those temperatures.
So I'm not fully propagating errors, partly because, as far as I'm aware, it's actually very hard to like quantify the errors on most of these tomographic models. So they might give you an uncertainty range, but no sort of exact errors that I could propagate. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's my understanding. So what I did instead was compare different tomographic models. So make sure that it's not just one freak model that used particular tweaking to get the right answer. And I've also made sure that I average a sort of a broader region around the volcanic province, because obviously seismology sees very different scales, very different resolution compared to sort of one volcanic melting event. So you can't, I mean, it's not fully propagated errors. There may be fairly large uncertainties with the sort of the seismological temperatures, but also with the petrological one as well. So the reason why I trust my results in the Western US particularly is because both of these methods give you the same answer, more or less.
I remember you showing that on a graph. Could you show that again? I was interested in.
This one?
Yeah, that one. So some of them do have their errors. Is that the model on the?
The errors in the seismological, so from the shear wave velocity, those temperatures are just from my regional average, if I remember correct. So in the Snake River Plain, you've got a very large error bar just because you're really close to the craton. craton edge. So you get bleeding of those very fast velocities into the average. So for this sample here, you're really close to these very fast velocities. So that's affecting the range in temperatures calculated from the seismological method. For the geochemical one, I think those errors are sort of the average uncertainties that are sort of involved in this technique, and they're to do with sort of how much you can vary the top of the melting column or the sort of maximum melt fraction and still get a good fit. And also there's uncertainties to do with where exactly you place the phase boundary between garnet and spinel, which is partly what controls our sort of sensitivity to depth and those sort of things. So, yeah.
Great. So I don't see any more questions in the chat, and just have a look in the, don't see any hands up either. So I might ask a question about what you're going to do in Eastern Australia. Clearly there's a lot of data that you could look at. Are you going to concentrate in one particular area first, or a particular age range? How are you going to proceed here?
I've actually, for now, I've literally looked at all of it and sort of done a fairly quick first pass analysis of all of these different samples. And I've now got some preliminary results that in some places are pretty interesting. So I'm now going to focus in on those places. So for example, in some of these, in the Pilbara, so some of these old cratons, you actually get a range of volcanics in the same place from different ages. And you can see a sort of gradual thickening of the lithosphere, which is curious. So there's a lot more work to be done to make sure that the numbers I'm getting out of the volcanic chemistry make sense, and sort of making sure my errors on those are well constrained. But yeah, some interesting things coming out of there.
We'll look forward to hearing more about your project as it evolves. I understand that you just got a year's extension, and so you'll be around a bit longer, which is fantastic, because we thought that you were leaving earlier. So that's wonderful news. So again, if you can join me in thanking Marthe in giving such a fantastic talk that was really global. I see a whole lot of hands clapping, so congratulations. And before you leave, I actually did make a mistake earlier. We do have a talk next week from Chengzu. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And so there is a talk next week. I got confused with another person. So enjoy that talk and enjoy your week. Thank you again, Marthe. Wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vern, for picking up that I'd missed the...
Marthe?
Yeah, no worries.
Is there time for a last question?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, so very nice talk, and it's amazing how you combine so many different techniques in your study. I was just curious, because you have shown 3 different mechanisms that could potentially explain the uplift in the eastern region of Brazil and also in the Angola. So the first option, I don't know if you can go back to your slide presentation where you show the three sketches. The first one was plume, but you do not observe thermal, yes, this one. So you do not observe such a thermal anomaly to propose a vertical mantle flow. And then you propose that most likely the lithospheric thinning would explain the best.
Yep.
Models, but I'm here wondering, sorry about my ignorance, I'm just wondering if it's not thermal related, what would be the cause for this lithospheric thinning in this uplift? It's not clear for me.
That is exactly the sort of the big next question, because arguably, like you could argue either way around, because you have a thinner lithosphere in places that channels mantle flow, and so you might see slight thermal anomalies because you've got thin lithosphere, or in places where you have slightly hotter temperatures at the base of the lithosphere, that might actually erode the base of the lithosphere and then give you thin lithosphere. So what I didn't say actually in both of these cases, so both in Brazil and in Angola, the most volcanic outcrops lie along lithospheric scale old faults, essentially. So in sort of either rifted corridors or just sort of along faulted regions. And these faults aren't active at the moment, but they might indicate that they're sort of very localized, even thinner bits of the lithosphere potentially, or even just weaknesses within the lithosphere that have allowed the melt to escape. So I think initial stretching probably plays a big role, sort of something to sort of start off a weak spot at the base of the lithosphere.
Right.
And then you can sort of start eroding that.
So this stretching would be tectonic driven?
Yeah, I think both of those, so at least Cretaceous in origin, so from Gondwana breakup, and people have actually argued, especially in Angola, that some of those sutures are even older in age.
Right. Okay. Thank you. And if there is time, I was curious I was going to ask, when you go back to your gravity map,
Sorry,
I'm just going to stop
gravity
the
anomaly.
recording, if that's okay, Thuan.
Oh, yes. Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Penny.
Yeah, no problem. Okay.